Hi folks, Jamie here again. Over the weekend I was talking to a friend of mine, and after we got done talking I got home and he sent me a message, and it reads, "There's another name for advocacy. It's called radical, with their own personal agendas, excluding anyone not agreeing with them." Which gave me a little bit of pause to think about what he said. So I looked up the definitions. First of all, when it comes to advocacy, and this is from Merriam-Webster's dictionary online, and it defines advocacy as the act or process of supporting a cause or purpose. The act or process of advocating, something known from his advocacy of gay rights. Okay, that is the definition of advocacy. The other one is radical. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4 put down for the definition of it relating to advocacy. First is very different from the usual or traditional. Second, favoring extreme changes in existing views, habits, conditions, or institutions. The third is associated with political views, practices, and policies of extreme change. The fourth is advocating extreme measures to retain or restore a political state of affairs, the radical right. And the very last one is a slang used in, like, say, Tom is being very radical. But I went and also decided to look up the definition of normal. One of the definitions is and this is the first within that definition. And reminder, this is all from Merriam-Webster. Conforming to a type, standard, or regular pattern, characterized by that which is considered usual, typical, or routine, normal working hours under normal circumstances. It was just a normal average day. Continues with, you had a normal childhood, the reaction to the news was normal, you didn't expect it. You get the hint. When it comes to advocacy, and you can say that advocacy can be done and taken different ways. But the one that I really want to focus on is, say, advocating. A few examples is advocating for civil rights, women's rights, justice reform, reform in policing. There are groups and organizations that do this work. This is not a radical idea at all. This has been around for a very long time. It's just that there are those people that consider this stuff to be radical in itself. Hence, they tend to want to maintain a sense of normality or a sense of normal. But we also have to take a look at the way that legislation and political leaders go about that too. A good example is back in the 60s, well, 50s and 60s, with the civil rights movement, which is still very much happening even to this day. Prime example being the Black Lives Matter rallies of last year, which they do continue to a certain point. And that's in the way of policing reform. There are many good ideas when it comes to reforming law enforcement. And I hate to say this, but it does not include defunding the police. That is a negative. I know some of those that are in law enforcement, and one of them is a very good friend of mine, and he even admits that, yeah, there needs to be reforms, there needs to be changes done within law enforcement, but also when it pertains to those people of color, blacks, browns, Latinos, and they are the ones that are mostly impacted by what is currently put in law, but also that in which we see as normal. Talking with someone who's running for Congress, he understands that type of stuff. Very interesting person, to say the least. But there are a lot of changes that need to be made when it comes to policing. But also there needs to be reforms done within our judicial system, but also when it comes to incarceration. Because the norm has always been, and it still is to this day, that those people of color tend to get harsher sentences than those that are white like me. And a prime example being that if, say, I got stopped by a police officer and I had possession of cocaine or heroin or something like that, I would see a lighter sentence from that as opposed to somebody that's black, brown, or Latino. They would see a harsher sentence, but also they would see themselves incarcerated, which I would probably end up getting probation. Chances are. First offender, no previous record, so on and so forth. But a black person, brown, or Latino in the same situation where there is no previous record or anything like that, they tend to get the maximum. And that is what these different groups and organizations are advocating for, is the reforming of how our overall justice system, going from law enforcement to the courts to being incarcerated. This stuff is not radical in itself, though there are people that see it as being very radical. Another example is when it comes to climate. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, this is when Nixon was president, there was a great call for cleaning up the environment. There was a lot of things that were being broadcast on the news. One of them that still sticks out in my mind is what happened at Love Canal, where that area was so heavily polluted by industrial waste that it started to cause mental and physical deformities, mental health issues, you name it. And President Nixon, he formed the Environmental Protection Agency. We all know that as the EPA. They put policies and conditions onto different companies to prevent and to clean up the environment. When my family moved to Plattsburgh, this was back in '73, Lake Champlain was heavily polluted. And it took a lot of work and a lot of time. And this was not a radical idea. This was very much what everybody wanted to see happen. And over the decades, with both the federal, state, local governments working together on both sides of the lake, they were able to get the lake cleaned up, and it has been cleaned for a good long time. There are those areas in which, yes, there is runoff from different farms that affect the lake, that being the algae blooms and different stuff, but the fines levied on polluters tends to be not exactly where it should be. Environmental activists have been advocating for a cleaner environment, which benefits us all. Now we have what's called climate change. And it's a uphill battle because you have big oil, and I'm singling out ExxonMobil and others that contribute to this stuff, that have contributed to climate change. And these advocates, these organizations like Greenpeace and others, they have been pushing for legislation within our government and other governments throughout the world to levy heavier fines on these different companies. This stuff has not been fully enforced, and that has to do with those in political leadership and our elected officials. But when you have oil companies, or now we call them energy companies, being heavily subsidized by not just our government but by other governments, it starts to not make sense. They want to keep this status quo, this normal, where we are reliant on what they produce, what they get out of the ground. Currently, out in the West, because of climate change, we have seen increasing temperatures and wildfires that, believe it or not, affects us here in Plattsburgh. Because of, even though we may not get that full impact from forest fires out west, we do get the residue effects. And the oil companies see moving towards, and those that benefit from these oil companies in the way of lobbyists and that type of money that they pour into political campaigns, the politicians reap that benefit to keep them from doing what needs to be done when it comes to the environment. What we need is a new normal. And we're slowly moving towards that new normal when it comes to electric vehicles, solar, wind, in some cases hydro, because in some cases, in some countries, hydro is a little bit more easier to do than the others, though in the way of cost. But even that is just a drop in the bucket. And there are those that are pushing harder, these different organizations and groups, like I say, Greenpeace being one of them, that are putting forth what those on the right and those that ignore climate change tend to label as being radical. And we have seen the results of it, because this stuff is put into policy. Not just in our country, but in other countries. Yes, we have become less dependent on the Gulf states, which are big oil producers. But what would be, and this is considered to be a very radical idea that a lot of people have said, but because of our politicians in Washington, they refuse to go in this direction, and that is to pull taxpayer-funded subsidies from these energy companies, these oil companies, and put all that money into renewable energies, i.e. wind, solar, so on. So we still have an uphill battle, and time is running short. A recent report that was issued, I think it was just earlier this week, maybe it was last week, the deforestation of the Amazon has caused more greenhouse gases to be emitted, which escalates that whole greenhouse effect that is causing climate change to happen. You don't have to take my word for it. You can research this yourself. But the whole thing of trying to keep people wanting things to stay normal, to keep with the status quo, is a tough battle in itself. A good example being civil rights, women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights. Only a few years back, here in New York, and I'm talking about 10 years ago or so, gay and lesbians were able to marry. When Obama was in the White House, and the Supreme Court upheld it, and that's marriage equality. Meaning now, throughout the U.S., a gay man or a gay woman can marry the same, marry that person that they are very much in love with, as opposed to in the past. Those that are on the religious right and conservative right, along with the evangelicals, they don't like that. They consider that to be a radical departure from what they term as normal marriage, which everybody's allowed to their opinions. I'm not arguing that. But when you try to maintain a status quo, a normal, it doesn't bode good for the majority. And it's still a battle, regardless of how you may think of it. Within the last few years in the state of New York, and this is something that the organization that I'm with, along with others in the LGBTQ plus community, have advocated for, and that's gender equality. The Gender Equality Non-Discrimination Act was passed by the state legislature and signed into law by Governor Cuomo, which gives those people in the LGBTQ community explicit rights under law. It's not perfect. There is a similar piece of legislation in Congress. The House has their version, the Senate has their version. They're both the same thing. And at one point in time, it passed the House. Matter of fact, it passed the House twice. But it kept on dying in the Senate because it was refused to be brought up for any discussion or debate. And that's because those elected officials consider that to be radical. I have looked at that legislation, I have read it through, I have checked and looked at previous civil rights that it's out there, and all it is simply doing is just changing certain words within the original civil rights legislation that was passed back in the 60s. Thus, there is no federal protections for LGBTQ people at the federal level. There's some states that do have protections, like New York and Vermont and Massachusetts. But as far as there being at the federal level, there is none. Which is still something that different LGBTQ organizations are advocating for. Yes, those on the political right, and I'm not saying all those on the political right, but there are enough of them, along with the religious right, that don't like it. They consider it to be radical. There you go. Because they do not consider it to be normal. It's just the same thing when it comes to women's health care rights. There are states that are putting restrictions on abortion, which Planned Parenthood and other organizations are currently litigating in courts. Recently, here, and I'm thinking that it's going to either be happening here soon, is that the Supreme Court may be taking up Roe v. Wade again, even though they've already decided on it. And these states that are fighting to get Roe v. Wade overturned aren't looking at what the people want. Their constituents, their residents. But advocacy is hard work. It takes time. And within those groups that are advocating all this, there are those that tend to lean more into the extreme, which we all consider to be radical in itself. But after a period of time, what is considered to be radical becomes normal. It's just the way that things are. What is radical is a small group of people trying to overthrow a government to install a dictator or an authoritarian because they think that that person will fix everything. That is not true. It takes all of us working together to fix the problems that we have now and for the future. I do not consider myself to be a radical. I advocate for common sense stuff. Gun reform, policing reform, judicial reform, and so on. These things should not be politicized, yet they are. And we continue to be divided along these different lines of ideas and thoughts. And It's hard. It's hard work. It's time consuming. But eventually, God given, we will get to a point where even those that are on the extreme right would agree that these changes need to be made if we're to survive as a species, as a community, as a nation. But that's all I have for now. Folks, have a nice day. Enjoy the sun and the warm weather. But also, if you like this video and you'd like to see more, click on the subscribe button down below and follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. Until then, like I say, have a nice day and enjoy the sunny weather.